Alright everyone, welcome back to the online video lecture series for Philosophy 102 Ethics. In this video we are going to begin our discussion of the second section of Kant's groundwork. And before we do that, we should think about again a few of the major points that we saw from the first section, which was covered in the series of lecture videos from last week. So remember, in the first section, Kant wants to accomplish a couple of things. And the main points are this. First, he wants to explain why for him the ultimate value is what he calls a good will. And the will is just your ability to form intentions to act. It's a capacity that all rational human beings have. And so you exercise your will correctly. You have a good will when you form the correct sorts of intentions. And we're going to see more in this lesson about what it means to form the right sort of intention. But the main point he wants to make about the goodwill is that a goodwill is good, as he puts it, regardless of what it affects or accomplishes. He says even if it brings about no good consequence, its value would still shine forth like a jewel. And this forms the basis of Kant's anti-utilitarianism, his anti-consequentialism. He does not think that, from a moral point of view, that what really matters are the consequences of our actions. Rather, it's the principle which you act upon. It's the intention that you form to act. So that's one thing. And the second thing we saw is, for him, the way in which you have a good will is by acting from duty. So there are these, how should I put it? There are these rules which we'll call moral laws, which govern the moral universe, just like physical laws govern the physical universe. And he says the right way to have a good will is to not just to follow those moral laws. So if the moral law says don't lie, the right thing to do isn't just to not lie, but it's to not lie because the moral law says so. And when you do the right thing for that reason, you show, as he says, respect for the moral law, then your action, he says, has true and genuine moral worth. Okay, so these are the major points we hit last time. But the remaining question at this point should really be, okay, let's say I get that there are these moral laws, I have to show respect for these moral laws, but where in the world do these come from, and how do I know what the moral laws are? Right, so far I've just been telling you that Kant thinks it's always wrong to lie, or always wrong to steal, or there's all these moral absolutes. But the question should be, well, how do I know that? What's the argument for thinking that those are the moral laws? So we're going to begin to cover that in this video. And the way I like to think about it, and here's just sort of a recap of what we were just talking about, right? Act from duty, you show respect for the moral law. So the way I like to think about this is, let's imagine you are in a job interview. So you're in a job interview for a very desirable position, something you've been working for a long time, something you very, very much want. It's also a very competitive position. There are also many other people who would like it as well. Now, of course, in approaching this, you would do all the normal preparation. You would make sure to research the company. You would sharpen up your resume. You would do everything that you would expect you would do. But also you say, you know what? There's this one lie I know I could tell, which I know would greatly increase my chances of getting the job. And I also know that they won't find out about. Now, oftentimes this isn't the case. Like in many situations, there might be a lie you could tell, and it might help you out, except for the fact that you would probably be caught. But let's just imagine there's a lie you could tell in this job interview that you know they would not catch you. Some certification you say you have that they couldn't find out about, or something of that sort. So the question you're faced with as you're sitting before the interviewers is, ought I lie in this job interview? Should I tell this lie? Now, if Kant is right, when you're thinking about this question, we're making use of our practical reason. So remember, what practical reason just means is your ability to use your reason and your ability to think to influence your will. Right? To put it even more plainly, just your ability to think about how you're going to act. So I'm thinking, okay, should I tell this lie or not? I need to use my practical reason. I need to think through the choices and think about how I should act. How I should exercise my will. And for Kant, he says when we're doing this, when we're using our practical reason to determine how we're going to act, what we're producing are a set of practical laws. Okay, so here's the quote from Kant. It says, "Everything in nature works according to laws. Only a rational being has the capacity to act according to the representation of laws, i.e. according to principles, and reason is required for deriving actions from laws." So he says, when you're thinking about what to do, fundamentally, you're not just deciding what to do in this specific instance, right? You're not just saying, well, I think in this situation, this is how I'm going to act. No, what reason does is it establishes certain laws or rules of action that you're implicitly saying that you're going to follow. And this is similar to how he sees reason generally. So let's get out of the moral realm for a second, go back to the scientific realm, well, the realm of physics. So remember, in the preface, he says, well, in physics, we are discovering laws of nature. We use reason to do that. So in that sphere, we use our reason, and what is the output? Certain laws. And what are those laws? Physical laws like gravitational constants and things of that sort that govern how physical bodies move. He says it's the same in the moral realm, in the practical realm. When you're thinking about what to do, what you are doing is legislating a certain set of rules or laws or guidelines for yourself. So practical reason, the point of it is to discover these practical laws for how you're going to act. All right. And he has a special name for these practical laws, and these practical laws he calls an imperative. An imperative you can just think of sort of like a command. So anytime you tell someone to do something, you say you should do something, you ought to do something, or it's your obligation to do something, that's an imperative. And the way he describes this is, it's a representation of an objective principle insofar as it is necessitating for a will. So you're just saying, here's a principle that is going to govern or tell a will how it should act. Okay, so practical reason is meant to discover imperatives. Now, there's something particular about imperatives that is going to be very important for Kant. And as we're going to see in this lesson, in this video in particular, he's going to describe two different kinds of imperatives, only one of which is going to be the imperative of morality. Okay, so the first thing he says about imperatives, all imperatives are expressed by an ought. And what this means fundamentally is that there's a certain sort of relationship. There's a certain fundamental feature or characteristic that applies to all imperatives. And I'm going to call this the ought or should relationship. So, to see what I mean, here are 4 different imperatives. You ought to study for your philosophy exam. You should clean your room once per week. You ought not lie during a job interview. You should not kill another innocent human being. Now, these 4 statements are, of course, very different in many ways. Some are about rather trivial matters like cleaning your room. Others about whether you ought to take the life of another innocent person. So the topic or subject matter is different. But they're all similar in the following way. Each of these statements is telling you something that you should or should not do, or ought not do. And of course, what does that mean? Because when you say that someone should do something, what are you telling them? Well, you know that, for instance, your parents might, have told you in the past, you should clean your room once a week. And then, a couple days later, they go up to your room and it's still a complete disaster. There's clothes everywhere. There's books all over the floor. Well, if we're talking about my son Mason's room, there's books all over the floor because he will never, under any circumstances, will he allow his books to remain in his bookshelves. So you recognize that you can tell someone that they ought or should do something, and you know at the same time that they're not necessarily going to do it. They may not follow through. So there's something strange about this ought or should relationship. There's something strange about this idea of giving a command. What are we doing when we're saying someone should do something? What is the force of the obligation? Okay, so to get a better handle on this, and this is right the way that Kant describes it, when we're talking about an imperative that's expressed by an ought, if you skip down to this sentence here, he says, they say that to do or to omit something would be good. So these imperatives say to do this thing or not do this thing would be good. But they say it to a will that does not always do something just because it's represented to it that it would be good. So imperatives say, look, here's this thing that it would be good for you to do or not do. Don't lie. Clean your room. Don't kill that innocent person. But at the same time recognize that this will might just totally ignore that advice. That even though this action is represented to it as good, that representation is not going to be enough to ensure that it does this good thing or doesn't do the bad thing. And because this is the case about imperatives, it's only a specific type of being that's actually able to follow imperatives. It's only a specific type of being that it would be worthwhile or it would make sense to express an imperative toward. So here are some examples. Right. So when we have an imperative, just to sort of recap, a sort of visual recap, when you have an imperative, it says you ought to do X, and it's saying this to a will that's capable of either obeying or disobeying that command. Right? This is the fundamental characteristic of the ought-should relationship, the fundamental characteristic of an imperative. So what are some examples? Well, when I say that it takes a very particular sort of being. So Kant says, look, when we think about imperatives, they only apply, because that's the case, to beings that can possibly obey or disobey the imperative. So first he says, let's think about some beings that would be impossible for them to obey an imperative. And here we have in mind non-rational beings. So what do we have in mind? Well, things like, trees. They don't have a will at all. They don't have conscious mental states. You could tell a tree, you must grow, or you could tell it, stop producing apples, and it won't make any difference. Now, of course, animals, here's a camel, a funny picture of a camel. Animals are a little different story, right? Because we might say this is more controversial. It might seem actually in many cases that animals, to some extent, do have a will and can take commands. But in part, this is because Kant had, a sort of a rather dim view of animals. Again, like I explained in the previous video, for him, animals really act just on instinct. And because they really just act on instinct, they don't have practical reason. So even if you can give an animal a command to do something, it might respond to it in a way it's been trained or habituated. You might have imparted or given it an instinct to act in a certain way. So, when you're playing catch with a dog and you throw the ball out and you say, go fetch or whatever, it may have been trained to go run after the ball after you say that, but it's not really using its reason to determine what to do. So, in that sense, it doesn't really have a will. So for that reason, the ought-should relationship doesn't apply to animals either. And then here's my son Mason. So this is this picture was taken when he was about 4 or 5 months old. Unless you think I was taking a picture of him specifically when he was upset. When I started to take this picture, he was perfectly happy. So shows how quickly things can change on a dime for a child that young. But just like animals, especially at the age he was at the time this picture was taken, he was not able to follow commands. He wasn't able to exercise practical reason. That, of course, is somewhat changing now, and it will continue to change, I would expect, of course, and hope as he gets older. But at the present moment, all of these entities are non-rational beings. They don't have practical reason, so they can't follow imperatives. Now, there's another class of beings that can't. So, for some, it's impossible for them to obey. They simply can't follow an imperative, even if you tell it to them. But there's other sorts of beings that it would be impossible for them to disobey. And this matters too, because remember, to follow an imperative, it must be possible that you obey or disobey the command it's giving you. And the example he has here are what we would call some perfectly good beings. So he says, thus a perfectly good will would just as much stand under objective laws of the good, but it cannot be represented as thereby necessitated to actions that conform with laws, because it can of itself, according to its subjective constitution, be determined only by the representation of the good. So what does he imagine here? So imagine a perfectly good being that can never possibly do what was wrong. right? Under no circumstances would it ever make the wrong choice. Now, you could give it commands, right? You could say, you shouldn't tell a lie in this job interview, you should clean your room, and it might follow those commands, or it would, because those are good things to do. But it would never disobey a bad command. If you said, never just never clean your room, just let it go astray, or lie every chance you get, it would disobey those bad commands. And there's never a circumstance in which it would disobey a good one. You would never say to a perfectly good being, oh, never tell a lie in a job interview, and it's like, well, what about just this one time? Well, no, if it's a perfectly good being, it would always follow commands which represent to it the good. And so for this reason, Kant says, if there were such a being, then imperatives also wouldn't apply to that being as well. So he says, therefore no imperatives hold for the divine will, and generally for a holy will. Here the ought is out of place, because willing already of itself necessarily agrees with the law. And so the sort of being he's imagining here would be something like God. And, if there is such a being, a God with perfect absolute goodness, a perfectly good being that would always do the right thing, you could make commands of God, you could give God imperatives, you should say God should do this or should do that, but it would be completely irrelevant. Because whether the command you're giving is good or bad, it would not matter, because God is always going to act on a perfect representation of what is good. God would never do the wrong thing. And so again, for perfectly good beings, the ought-should relationship is out of place. He says the ought is out of place, because such beings simply cannot disobey, right, imperatives. Okay, so for that reason, the only category that we have left, the only sort of being for whom the ought-should relationship makes any sense, are rational human beings. And more generally, rational beings if there were rational beings of other species. And so specifically, when we're talking about the ought-should relationship, we're talking specifically about a relationship that applies to the human will. So imperatives give commands. They give commands to the human will, knowing that the human will can then use its practical reason to decide to obey or disobey that command. Okay, so let's go back. So we have a sense of what an imperative is. We have a sense of the ought-should relationship. So now let's go back to our original question. Original question is, here you are sitting in the job interview. You're asking, ought I lie in this job interview? And we also know now that you have to use your practical reason to answer this question, and practical reason produces imperatives. And so at this point then you have to ask yourself, well, what are the different types of ways I could use my practical reason to develop imperatives? What are the different types of ways I could think about this situation? And for Kant, there are two. So here's an example of one thought process you might engage in. Will I be able to get away with lying during this interview? Will lying prevent me from getting the job? So if you're asking those questions, you're asking a question based on self-interest. And you might come up with the following imperative. I ought not do an action that will prevent me from getting this job. So if you're asking questions about what is the most efficient and effective way of securing the job, it might be to tell a lie, or it might be to not tell a lie, but that's just going to depend on, do you think you'll get caught? And you would be following the imperative or the general rule for action that you shouldn't do actions that are going to prevent you from getting the job. So in red here, this is one way of looking at the question. This is one way of looking at the issue. But there's another one as well. So let's look at the blue box over here. You might also ask yourself the question, is lying during a job interview a morally acceptable type of action? Now here, notice your consideration of self-interest doesn't really come into play. Your personal desires don't come into play. What's important here is lying the type of action which I should be doing or not? And here you're working more under the following sort of imperative. Very generally, I ought not or should not do an action that's inherently bad or morally corrupt by its nature. So one of the insights Kant makes is that we can use our reason for both of these purposes. We can use our reason to determine what are going to be the practical effects of our actions, and then to determine whether that's going to be good or bad for our self-interest. Or we can use our reason to say, is this the sort of action that in itself should be done or not? And as you might guess, the sort of question you're asking on this side for Kant is the question of morality. And the way he describes this, the sort of point I was just getting at, he says, because there are these two ways of thinking, there's also two different kinds of imperatives. And this is the famous distinction that Kant makes here in the second section. He says all imperatives command either hypothetically or categorically. So there are hypothetical imperatives and there are categorical imperatives. So what's a hypothetical imperative? Kant tells us that the former, the hypothetical imperative, represents the practical necessity of a possible action as a means for achieving something else that one wants. So you have some possible action, like telling a lie, and then you say, okay, what's the good that's being represented of this action? Well, some practical necessity for getting what you want. A hypothetical imperative would say, you should do X because this will be the outcome that will be good for you. Right? If you want to achieve X, then you ought to do action Y, something like that. Right? Hypothetical imperatives say, look, given what you want, given your desires, given the things you think are important, these are the ways that you should act. On the other hand, though, there are categorical imperatives. And Kant says the categorical imperative would be the one that represented an action as objectively necessary by itself, without reference to any other end. So let's go back up to this box in a minute. When I said, you might ask yourself, is lying during a job interview morally acceptable type of action? When you ask that question, you're not thinking about, will lying in this job interview make me happy? Will it make my family happy? Will it improve the functioning of this company? You're not asking any of that. You're asking, is lying the right thing to do or not? And this means when you ask that sort of question, you're in the realm of trying to determine categorical imperatives. You're asking yourself, is there some objectively necessary prohibition against lying or not? And when you're asking yourself that question, you're not thinking about any other end, any other purpose or gain or goal or desire you might have. So hypothetical imperatives tell us things that we should do if we have certain desires or goals. Categorical imperatives tell us things we must do no matter what we desire, no matter what our goals are, no matter what our personal preferences are. You absolutely must follow them. And to get a better sense, here are some examples of hypothetical and categorical imperatives. So 1, if you want to earn an A in Philosophy 102, you should study for your exam. If you want to have a neat and tidy living space, then you should clean your room once a week. Okay, so each of these imperatives represents some good to you. So getting an A in Philosophy 102, having a neat and tidy living space, those are good things. And then it says, look, if you want these good things, here's how you should act. You should study. You should clean your room. But notice, let's say, so let's look at imperative 2. Someone tells you, look, if you want to have a neat and tidy living space, clean your room once a week. And you say, well, I don't care about that. I'm not a very neat person. I'm not a clean person. I'm fine living like a slob. I don't mind a huge mess. I just don't want to take the time to clean it up. Now, if that were the case, if that was genuinely the sort of person you were, if you were just deceiving yourself, if because you might try to convince yourself that you're fine with your room being messy because you don't want to take the time to clean it. But if that's really what you wanted, then imperative 2 would have no sway, it would have no force over you. You would have no reason to follow this imperative. You'd have no reason to follow this imperative if you didn't want a neat and tidy living space. It just wouldn't matter to you. Same with 1. Look, if you don't want an A in the class, then, or even a B or C, then you have no reason to study. If you're fine getting a bad grade, if there's no part of you that thinks this is important, then you don't have a reason to study or follow that imperative. And that's the hallmark of all hypothetical imperatives. You can escape them. They're not categorically requiring you to do anything because they only matter for you if you have the appropriate desires. Okay, now let's compare that to categorical imperatives. Here are two different types. 3. You ought not lie during a job interview. 4. You should not kill another innocent human being. Now 3 is controversial because some people will say, that sometimes it is okay to lie, but let's just focus on 4, because if anything is a categorical imperative, most people would say, well, something like 4 might be a good example. So let's say you tell someone, who's plotting some plot of revenge or, some scheme to, some sort of get-rich-quick scheme that's going to involve actually taking the life of another innocent human being, and you're trying to talk them out of it. You say, look, it's a categorical imperative. You should not kill another innocent human being. It's morally wrong. And that person says, oh yeah, no, that's maybe for you. But look, I'm not the sort of person who cares about the lives of other human beings. It's just not, my personal preference is that it's not really that important to me. So just like I don't have to clean my room if I don't want a neat and tidy living space, the same goes, right? I don't have to refrain from killing innocent people if I don't care about human life. Now, at this point, Kant is going to say, well, no, this is a different sort of thing. This sort of imperative isn't one that you can just say you're not going to follow just because you don't have any desire to follow it, or you don't care about the underlying values that it's espousing. He's going to say, no, this is for all human beings, all rational beings. There's an absolute prohibition against killing another innocent human being. And that's it. Categorical imperatives are not meant to be escaped in the same way. They have a force for all rational beings. And he'll say the same thing about 3, and we'll look at his arguments about lying in more detail later on in other videos. But that's at least the basic distinction between hypothetical and categorical imperatives. Okay, so another way to think about this is, when you have a hypothetical imperative, the goodness, or think about it this way. Let's say you're trying to judge, is this a good imperative or not? Is it a useful imperative? Is this good advice? Because you ask yourself that question all the time. Someone tells you, look, this is what you should do. This is how you should act. They're giving you advice. So how do you generally judge that advice? So let's look at this imperative. If you want to earn an A in Philosophy 102, then you should study for your exam. So this is recommending some action, namely studying for the exam, to bring about an end or consequence, such as earning an A. And when you judge whether this is good advice, what you're really judging is this action an efficient method of achieving the end? Is studying actually a good way to get an A or not? And notice when you're judging in that way, you're not primarily thinking about whether this is a good end in itself. So here's the way Kant puts it. There is no question here whether the end is rational or good, but only what one must do in order to attain it. So the idea here is if you all care about this imperative, you already want an A in the class. You already wanted to get an A in your philosophy class. So when you're looking at this advice, you're just asking, is studying the best way or not? Studying would be one way, cheating might be another way, maybe stealing the exams out of the professor's office beforehand, copying down all the questions, and then knowing exactly what the exam is going to look like, that might be another way to get an A. So when you're looking at a hypothetical imperative, you're just saying, is studying for the exam the best way to achieve this end? Is cleaning my room once a week the best way to have a neat and tidy room? And if it is, it's good advice, it's a good hypothetical imperative. If not, it's a bad hypothetical imperative. But of course, when we're looking at a categorical imperative, we don't, if Kant's right about morality, we don't look at it the same way. In fact, when we look at a categorical imperative, the consequence of the action for Kant is irrelevant. So we have an act. So here's the imperative. You ought not lie during a job interview. So the action we're considering is not lying. And when we're asking, is this a good imperative or not? Is this a good categorical imperative? Kant tells us that we don't have to think at all about what the consequence of not lying is going to be. He says the imperative is categorical. It concerns not the matter of the action or what is to result from it. So the result is irrelevant, but the form and the principle from which it does itself follow. So when we're looking at a categorical imperative, we're just asking, is this action in and of itself something that is good or bad? Is it something we're allowed to perform, or is it inherently morally corrupt, inherently morally bad? It's the principle upon which we're acting that truly matters in this case. Okay, so to recap, go back to our original case. You're thinking about whether to lie during the job interview. If you're asking yourself, will I be able to get away with lying? Then you're constructing for yourself a hypothetical imperative. And it could be something like this. If you want to have the best chance of getting the job, then you should not lie or engage in fraud. That might be one hypothetical imperative, because they might catch you. Now, if in the other circumstance, if you knew they couldn't catch you, you might have a different hypothetical imperative. But in any case, your concern here is just, I have this desire to get a job. What's the most efficient and effective means of attaining that desire? But let's say you approach the question in the other way. Is lying during a job interview a morally acceptable type of action? Kant says that now you're asking a question about categorical imperatives. You're asking a question about, is lying itself morally good or bad? But here, we might be a little lost, we might be a little stuck, because you might say, well, what sort of imperative could command that something is unconditionally good regardless of the consequences? How could there be a type of command, a type of imperative which says, it doesn't matter what results from lying, it doesn't matter what results from killing another innocent human being, all that is irrelevant. What this imperative is telling you to do is unconditionally good. Or what it's telling you to refrain from doing or not do is unconditionally bad, no matter what. How in the world is that even imperative possible? Because most imperatives, again, like hypothetical ones, they appeal to our desires. If you want a clean room, right, then if you want a neat and tidy room, you should clean it once a week. If you want an A in the exam, you should study. But how could there be an imperative that tells us to do something even if we don't want to do it? That's what it would mean for an imperative to command unconditionally. And to find that out, we're going to have to wait until the next video when we go into, in a little more detail, actually much more detail, Kant's principle of the categorical imperative. So hopefully this video made clear the difference between hypothetical and categorical imperatives. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.